Story 1. The Whispering Tundra. Dr. Sarah Edmonds had spent 3 years preparing for her solo research expedition to the Arctic tundra north of the Brooks Range. As a wildlife biologist specializing in Arctic fox populations, she'd worked in remote locations before, but never this far north, never this isolated. In late October of 2022, she flew into a temporary research camp that would be her home until the supply plane returned in 6 weeks. The pilot, a grizzled bush flyer named Tom, helped her unload supplies at the weathered cabin. "You sure about this?" Tom asked, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "Polar night starts in 2 weeks. Won't see the sun again until January." Sarah nodded confidently. "That's exactly what I need. I'm studying how the foxes adapt their hunting behavior in complete darkness." Tom glanced at the horizon where the sun barely cleared the mountains anymore. "Just remember, things get strange out here when the darkness settles in. The old-timers, the Inupiat elders, they got stories about this area. Say the land itself talks when the sun disappears." Sarah smiled politely, dismissing it as the typical warning she received from locals uncomfortable with outsiders in their wilderness. Tom flew away, and she was alone with her equipment, her supplies, and 42 days of isolation ahead. The first week passed productively. She set up motion sensor cameras, established her observation protocols, and settled into the rhythm of Arctic research. The sun's appearance grew briefer each day, barely painting the horizon with dim light before vanishing again. Sarah documented everything meticulously, noting the fox's increased activity during the twilight hours. Then on November 7th, the polar night began. The sun failed to rise, leaving only a faint blue twilight that lasted a few hours before complete darkness descended. Sarah switched on her cabin's generator and continued her work using night vision equipment and thermal imaging cameras. That's when the whispering started. At first, she thought it was wind moving through the equipment or perhaps interference in her audio recorders. But the sound was too organized, too rhythmic to be natural. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, a constant susurration that rose and fell like breathing. Sarah checked all her equipment, finding nothing malfunctioning. The whispers continued, always just at the edge of perception. On the third night of complete darkness, she ventured out to check her remote cameras. The beam of her headlamp cut through the blackness, revealing the endless expanse of tundra stretching in every direction. The whispers grew louder outdoors, seeming to emanate from the ground itself. Sarah told herself it was geological, perhaps underground ice shifting or compressed air escaping from permafrost vents. But the sounds formed patterns that her brain couldn't help but interpret as words, though in no language she recognized. She reviewed her camera footage back at the cabin. The thermal images showed the usual Arctic foxes, a few caribou in the distance, and then something else. On the recording from November 8th at 11:47 p.m., a heat signature appeared that didn't match any known animal. It was human-shaped but moved wrong, its limbs bending at angles that defied anatomy. The figure approached her farthest camera, seemed to examine it, then moved directly toward her cabin with impossible speed before vanishing from frame. Sarah's hands trembled as she played the footage again. The shape was definitely bipedal, approximately 7 feet tall based on scale references, and its heat signature fluctuated wildly as though its body temperature was unstable. She checked the outdoor temperature logs. -42 degrees Fahrenheit. Nothing could survive out there without proper protection. Yet this thing had moved through the Arctic night as though the cold meant nothing. The whispers intensified that night, pressing against the cabin walls like physical force. Sarah lay in her sleeping bag, trying to rationalize what she'd seen. Hallucination from isolation? Carbon monoxide from the generator? She checked the CO detector. Nothing. The whispers rose to a crescendo around 3 a.m., then suddenly stopped, leaving a silence so complete it felt oppressive. She didn't sleep. At dawn, or what passed for dawn during polar night, she suited up and went outside to investigate. Her boot prints from the previous night were still visible in the frost. But beside them were other tracks. They resembled human footprints but were elongated, measuring nearly 18 inches long with 6 distinct toe impressions. The tracks circled her cabin repeatedly, stopping at each window as though something had peered inside. Sarah photographed everything, her scientific training overriding her fear. She followed the tracks away from the cabin. They led north across the tundra for approximately 200 yards before simply ending. No gradual fade from wind erosion, no indication the creature had turned or jumped. The prints just stopped in the middle of flat, open ground. The whispers returned with sunset, which at this latitude meant the brief cessation of, twilight. They were louder now, more insistent, and Sarah could almost distinguish individual voices within the cacophony. She barricaded herself in the cabin, piling supplies against the door, and tried to contact the research station in Deadhorse via satellite phone. Static answered her, though the equipment showed a strong signal. Days blurred together in the constant darkness. Sarah's thermal cameras captured the figure nightly now, always watching, always circling. Sometimes there were multiple signatures, 5 or 6 human-shaped forms moving in coordinated patterns around her research site. The whispers never stopped, growing into distinct sentences that she couldn't quite understand but felt she should recognize. On November 15th, her generator died. She had backup fuel, the equipment was well maintained, but it simply stopped working. Sarah tried everything, but the machine refused to start. Without power, she had no heat except for her emergency propane heater, which would last maybe 10 days. The temperature inside the cabin began dropping immediately. The figures appeared at her windows that night. She saw them clearly in the beam of her flashlight, faces pressed against the glass. They looked almost human, but the proportions were wrong. Eyes too large and entirely black, mouths that stretched too wide, skin pale as ice and translucent enough to see dark shapes moving beneath. They watched her with those void-like eyes, their mouths moving in sync with the whispers that now filled the cabin. Sarah tried the satellite phone again. This time it connected. "Please," she gasped. "Something's out here. They're at the windows. I need emergency extraction." The voice that answered wasn't Tom or anyone from the research station. It was a whisper, the same whisper that surrounded her cabin, but now coming through the phone's speaker. "Sarah," it said, pronouncing her name with too many syllables. "We've been calling you. Why won't you answer?" She threw the phone across the cabin. The figures at the windows didn't react, just continued staring, their mouths forming words she finally understood. "Come outside. Join us, it's so cold alone. Together we're warm." The propane heater sputtered and died on November 20th. Sarah wrapped herself in every piece of clothing she owned, huddling in her sleeping bag while the interior temperature plummeted. The figures no longer stayed outside. She could hear them moving through the cabin, their whispers intimate and close. Cold hands touched her face in the darkness, pulling at her sleeping bag. "Just come outside," they whispered. "We were like you once. Researchers, travelers, people who ventured too far into the long dark. Now we're part of it. The tundra keeps us, talks through us. It's not so bad. The cold stops hurting eventually." Sarah lasted until November 23rd. When Tom returned with supplies on December 2nd, he found the cabin empty, the door hanging open. Sarah's equipment was still there, her journals documenting the encounters written in increasingly erratic handwriting. The final entry, dated November 23rd, simply read, "They're not asking anymore. I can feel my body temperature dropping. The whispers are inside me now. I understand what they want. I understand what this place is. The tundra doesn't just exist. It's aware, it's hungry, and it's so very, very lonely. Search teams found nothing. Sarah's footprints led away from the cabin, heading north, accompanied by 6 sets of those elongated 6-toed tracks. All the prints ended together exactly 1.3 miles from the cabin, stopping mid-stride in the frozen wasteland. Story 2. The Frozen Broadcast. Marcus Chen had been a radio operator for 15 years, but his posting to the communications station at Summit Lake in January of 2023 was his first assignment in Alaska. The isolated facility, located 60 miles northwest of Paxson, maintained emergency communication relays for aircraft and remote settlements across the interior. Marcus would spend 4 months alone at the station, rotating with another operator who'd just finished his winter shift. "You'll love the quiet," Jerry, the outgoing operator, told him during the handoff. "Nothing but you, the equipment, and the aurora. Perfect place to clear your head." Marcus noticed Jerry's hands shook slightly as he demonstrated the equipment protocols. "You okay, man?" Jerry paused, then shook his head. "Just tired. 4 months is a long time alone. You'll understand." He hesitated at the door, his bags already loaded in the snowmobile outside. "One thing. If you pick up anything on frequency 4625 kHz, don't respond. Just log it and move on." "What comes through on that frequency?" "Nothing official," Jerry said. "Just don't engage with it, trust me." The first week proceeded normally. Marcus settled into his routine, monitoring official channels, performing equipment maintenance, reading during the long, dark hours. The station was comfortable enough, well insulated and heated, with enough supplies for 6 months if necessary. The isolation didn't bother him. He'd always preferred solitude. On January 12th, during his routine frequency sweep, he detected a transmission on 4625 kHz. The frequency was supposedly reserved for a Russian military installation known as the buzzer, which broadcast a repetitive tone interrupted occasionally by coded messages. But what Marcus heard wasn't the expected buzzer sound. It was a voice speaking English with no accent, perfectly clear. "Station Summit Lake, respond please. This is Research Team Theta 9. We are in distress. Coordinates 63.45 north, 145.22 west. Immediate assistance required." Marcus checked the coordinates. They placed the transmission's origin approximately 30 miles northeast of his position, deep in the Alaska Range wilderness. No research teams were registered in that area according to his logs. He keyed his microphone. "Research Team Theta 9, this is Summit Lake Communications. Please identify your agency and situation." Static answered him for several seconds. Then the voice returned, identical in tone and inflection. "Station Summit Lake, respond please. This is Research Team Theta 9. We are in distress. Coordinates 63.45 north, 145.22 west. Immediate assistance required." It was the exact same message, word for word, with the same emphasis and pauses. A recording, then. Marcus tried hailing them again, but received only repetitions of the identical message. He logged the incident and tried contacting the research station in Fairbanks via his official channels. They had no record of any team called Theta 9, past or present. The transmission repeated every 6 hours, always on 4625 kHz, always identical. Marcus tried to ignore it as Jerry had advised, but professional curiosity got the better of him. On January 15th, he conducted a thorough search of historical records in the station's archives. What he found disturbed him. Theta 9 had existed. It was a geological survey team that went missing in March of 1996, 27 years ago. 5 researchers had been conducting seismic studies in the Alaska Range when they stopped reporting. A search found their base camp abandoned, equipment still running, personal effects undisturbed. The team members were never found. The coordinates in the broadcast matched the location where their camp had been discovered. Marcus stared at the file, his coffee growing cold. Someone was either playing an elaborate prank or something impossible was happening. Dead men's voices don't broadcast for 27 years. He decided to document everything carefully, recording each transmission and noting any variations. That night, the broadcast changed. The voice said, "Marcus, we need you to come find us. We're so cold. We've been waiting so long. Please, Marcus, come to the coordinates. We can't leave without help." His name. The voice knew his name. Marcus felt ice water run down his spine. He checked all his equipment for hacking or external access. Everything was secure, air-gapped from any network. The station's location wasn't public information. There was no way anyone could have known his name unless they had access to classified personnel records. "Who is this?" Marcus demanded into the microphone. "Identify yourself immediately." "We told you," the voice responded, and now Marcus could hear others in the background, whispered voices layered beneath the primary speaker. "We're Theta 9, Dr. Robert Hammond, Dr. Lisa Kwan, James Okoye, Sarah Brennan, Thomas Wolfe. We've been here since March of 1996. We need help, Marcus. The cold has us. We can't leave. But you can free us. Just come to the coordinates." Marcus pulled up the original files on Theta 9. Those were indeed the names of the missing researchers. Information that was publicly available, he told himself. Someone was messing with him using old tragedy and modern technology. But the transmissions continued, growing more personal. They described the interior of his station, rooms they couldn't possibly see. They mentioned his daughter Emma back in Seattle, her recent birthday, the gift he'd sent. They knew about his divorce, about the reasons he'd taken this isolated posting, information that existed nowhere in any database connected to this location. "How do you know these things?" Marcus shouted at the radio on January 19th. "We can see you, Marcus," the voices whispered. "We've been here so long that we're part of the ice now, part of the ground, part of the radio waves themselves. We're in everything out here. The cold preserves. It changes. It makes us eternal. But we want to leave. We want to be warm again. You can help us. Just come to the coordinates. Bring us back." Marcus stopped responding, but the broadcasts never ceased. Every hour now, the voices called to him, pleading, demanding, threatening. He tried shutting down the receiver, but the voices came through other equipment, through his computer speakers, through the static on his weather radio. They were everywhere. On January 25th, he looked out his window and saw lights moving across the frozen lake. 5 lights, arranged in a purposeful formation, approaching the station. Marcus grabbed his binoculars, but the lights remained indistinct, glowing orbs that seemed to pulse with cold blue luminescence. They moved across the ice without leaving tracks, drawing steadily closer. The voices grew excited. "Yes, Marcus, we're coming. We can almost reach you. Just open the door. Let us in. We've been frozen for so long." Marcus barricaded the doors and windows, piling furniture against them. The lights circled the station, passing directly through solid walls as though they weren't there. Where they passed, frost formed in elaborate patterns, crystals that resembled reaching hands and screaming faces. "You can't keep us out," the voices said, now coming from inside the station. "We're already here. We've always been here. Every radio wave carries us. Every frequency holds our voice. We're in the wires, in the electricity, in the very air you breathe. The cold brought us back. The cold gave us form. And now we need a body. We need warmth. We need life." The lights converged in Marcus's main room, coalescing into 5 distinct forms. They were roughly human-shaped, but composed entirely of that cold blue luminescence and frozen mist. He could see through them to the equipment beyond. But they had faces, tortured faces locked in expressions of suffering and hunger. Please, the central figure whispered, and Marcus recognized the voice as the primary broadcaster. I'm Dr. Robert Hammond. We've been trapped between life and death for 27 years. The seismic equipment we were using, it opened something. A frequency that shouldn't exist. We fell into it, into the cold spaces between radio waves. We need life to anchor us. We need flesh to wear. Let us in, Marcus. Let us be warm again. Marcus's survival instinct kicked in. He grabbed the emergency flare gun from his supplies and fired it directly into the central figure. The flare passed through the entity, embedding in the far wall. But the brief heat from the projectile caused the being to recoil, its luminescence flickering and dimming. Heat. They were vulnerable to heat. Marcus grabbed every heat source he had. Propane torches, emergency heaters, flare packs. He ignited all of them, turning his station into a furnace. The temperature soared to over 90 degrees. The entities writhed and screamed, their forms distorting and fragmenting. The voices on the radio became shrieks of agony. "Stop! You're killing us! We just want to live!" "You're already dead," Marcus shouted back. "You died in 1996. Let go!" The figures dissipated slowly, breaking apart into wisps of luminescent fog that evaporated in the heat. As they faded, Marcus heard their final words, resigned and infinitely sad. "We know. We've always known. But the cold wouldn't let us leave. The frequencies kept us here, kept us aware. Thank you, Marcus. Thank you for the warmth, even if just for a moment." When the relief operator arrived on February 10th to check on Marcus after he'd missed several scheduled reports, they found him unconscious from heat exhaustion. The station's interior was over 100 degrees, every heating element running at maximum. Marcus had dehydrated to the point of kidney failure. He spent 2 weeks in the hospital in Fairbanks recovering. He told no one what had happened, knowing they'd never believe him. But he never took another radio posting. The sound of static made him physically ill. And sometimes, late at night, he still heard those whispers calling from the spaces between frequencies. The voices of the dead who couldn't escape the Alaskan cold. The communications station at Summit Lake was permanently closed after Marcus's incident. Official reports cited equipment malfunction and unsuitability for single-operator posting. But the radio logs from his tenure disappeared from official records, and frequency 4625 kHz is now permanently monitored but never transmitted on in Alaskan airspace. Story 3. The Village That Remembered. Elena Vasquez had taken the teaching position in Kayasik, a remote Inupiat village of 93 people on Alaska's northwest coast, because she wanted to make a difference. In August of 2021, she arrived via bush plane, greeted by the village council and a handful of curious children. The village elder, a woman named Irene who appeared to be in her 80s, welcomed Elena with reservation. "You're here to teach our children," Irene said, her eyes sharp, despite her age. "That's good. They need knowledge of both worlds, but you must also learn from us. This village, it has memory. The land has memory. Do not disturb what should stay forgotten." Elena smiled and nodded, thinking it was cultural advice about respecting traditions. She had no idea what Irene truly meant. The village was beautiful in its starkness, a cluster of modern prefab houses mixed with traditional structures surrounded by endless tundra on 3 sides and the Chukchi Sea on the 4th. The school was a small building serving 15 students from ages 5 to 18. Elena threw herself into teaching, developing lesson plans that incorporated local culture and history alongside standard curriculum. The first strange occurrence happened in late September. One of her students, a 12-year-old boy named Isaac, was writing an essay about his grandfather. Elena glanced at his paper and noticed he'd written, "My grandfather Malik fought in the war against the Japanese. He was very brave at Attu Island." "Isaac," Elena said gently, The Battle of Attu was in 1943. Your grandfather couldn't have fought there. He'd have to be almost 90 years old now. Isaac looked at her with confusion. But he is 92. He lives in the blue house by the water. You can ask him. Elena was certain Isaac's grandfather had died years ago. She'd seen the family tree project the students had made earlier in the month. But that afternoon, Isaac took her to the blue house, and there sat an elderly man who introduced himself as Malik Ayuga Aktuk. I remember Attu, he told her, showing her a photograph of himself in military uniform, young and strong. Coldest battle I ever fought. Lost 3 toes to frostbite, see? He removed his sock, showing his mangled foot. Elena was baffled. All the records showed Malik had died in 2009, yet here he sat, solid and real, drinking tea and sharing war stories. She chalked it up to a records error, or perhaps a misunderstanding about family naming traditions. But then it happened again, and again. Students would mention relatives Elena knew for certain had died, and then she'd meet those relatives alive and seemingly unaware anything was unusual. The village had a population of 93 living people according to the last census, but Elena was certain she'd met at least 140 distinct individuals. She brought this up carefully with another teacher, a young Inupiat woman named Grace who'd grown up in Kayasik. Grace's expression turned serious. "You've noticed," she said simply. "Most outsiders don't, at least not this quickly. Kayasik means the place that returns in our language. People here, when they die, sometimes they come back. Not like zombies or spirits. They come back as themselves with all their memories, and they live again. It's been happening since the village was founded over 300 years ago." Elena laughed nervously. "That's impossible. People don't just come back from death." "Not everywhere," Grace agreed. "But here they do. The land remembers them. And sometimes, when it's important, when the village needs them, the land gives them back. Old Malik, he died of cancer 12 years ago, but last spring he walked out of the tundra looking exactly as he did before the cancer took him. He remembers dying. He remembers his funeral. But he's alive now. The land wanted him back." Elena should have left then. Should have caught the next supply plane and fled back to civilization. But she was a scientist at heart, and this was impossible. She needed to understand. She began documenting everything carefully. She discovered that 19 current residents of Kayasik had death certificates on file with the state. Not errors or mistaken identities, but the actual people who had officially died. Some had returned after months, others after years, one woman after 36 years. They returned unchanged, at the age they died, with complete memories of their previous life and their death. But there were rules, Irene eventually explained. The land gives back what it remembers, but memory has a cost. Every person who returns takes something from the living, a year of life shared among all of us. When 20 people have returned, we've each given up 20 years. Look at me. I'm 53 years old, but I look 80. The village keeps our dead, but it ages us in return." Elena examined birth records. Irene was right. Villagers aged faster here, perhaps twice as quickly as normal. A 40-year-old had the body of someone nearing 70. Yet they accepted this as natural, as the price for keeping their loved ones. "Why don't you leave?" Elena asked. "Why stay if it's killing you?" Irene smiled sadly. "Because we love them. Because family is everything. And because the land won't let us take them away. Anyone who returns, if they leave Kayasik, they die again within days. We tried in the 70s. 5 returned people flew to Anchorage for a cultural festival. All 5 died before the plane landed. Heart failure, the doctor said. But we knew. The land can only remember them here." Elena wanted to dismiss this as mass delusion or some environmental factor causing false memories. But she couldn't deny what she witnessed daily. People who had official death certificates were alive, teaching her students, fishing, living normal lives. And the living villagers did age too quickly, their bodies wearing out decades before they should. The first snowfall came in October, and with it something changed. Elena noticed people she'd never seen before appearing in the village. At first, just one or two, then dozens. They emerged from the tundra, walking out of snowstorms with no gear, no explanation. All of them were people who had died years or decades ago. The land remembers strongest in winter, Grace explained. Something about the cold, the darkness, the way ice preserves. Winter brings them back more than any other season. By December, we'll have over 200 people here. Some of them died 50 years ago. They'll stay until spring, then fade back into the land when it thaws. Elena watched this impossible resurrection in growing horror. The village swelled with returned dead, all acting perfectly normal, greeting family members who'd mourned them. She met a teenager named Jacob who died in a boating accident in 1978 but appeared every winter, still 17, to visit his sister who was now in her 60s. "Don't you want to move on?" Elena asked him. "To whatever comes after?" Jacob looked puzzled. "After? I am after. I died. The land remembered me. This is my after. I come back every winter. I see my family. I live again for a season. When spring comes, I return to the land. I sleep in the permafrost and dream of the village. It's not so bad, better than being forgotten." The phenomenon accelerated as the polar night approached. By mid-November, when the sun disappeared below the horizon for 2 months, the village population had nearly tripled. Returned people filled every house, building new temporary shelters from ice and sod. They held celebrations, reunions impossible anywhere else on Earth. But Elena noticed something the villagers seemed to ignore or accept. The living were dying faster now. The accelerated aging intensified with each returned person. Grace, who was 28, now looked 50. Children developed gray hair and joint problems. The cost of resurrection was escalating. Elena confronted Irene. "This is killing all of you, can't you see? In a few more years there won't be any living people left, just an empty village full of returned dead who'll fade when spring comes." Irene nodded slowly. "We know. The elders have debated this for generations. But what would you have us do? Tell our mothers and fathers, our children and siblings that they can't come back? That we won't pay the price for their return? We are Inupiat. Community is everything. The dead are still community. We choose them, even if it costs us years." That night, Elena made her decision. She couldn't stay in a place where death was reversed at such terrible cost. She'd arranged for a pickup in 3 days when the monthly supply flight came through. But she made the mistake of telling Grace her plans. "You can't leave," Grace said, her prematurely aged face sad but determined. "You've seen too much. You've been here too long. The land has started to remember you. If you leave now, if you spread what you've seen, if you bring authorities or scientists, they'll destroy this place. They'll force us to relocate, separate us from the land. Our dead will stay dead, and that's a cruelty we can't allow." Elena tried to leave anyway, packing in secret. But when the supply plane arrived on November 23rd, she found herself unable to board. Her legs wouldn't respond, rooted to the frozen ground. The other villagers watched sadly as she struggled. "The land has claimed you," Irene said. "I'm sorry I tried to warn you. Don't disturb what should stay forgotten. You learned our secret too well. Now you're part of it." Elena lived in Kayasik for the rest of that winter, aging rapidly, her 26-year-old body taking on the characteristics of someone 40 years older. She understood now. The land didn't just remember the dead. It bound the living, keeping them there to fuel the resurrections, trapping them in an endless cycle of death and return. When spring came in March, the returned people faded back into the land, walking out into the tundra and disappearing into melting snow. The village population returned to 93 living souls, 94 including Elena. She tried to leave again when the next supply flight came. This time her legs worked, but the moment the plane lifted off, her heart began to fail. The pilot made an emergency landing, saving her life. The land wouldn't let her go. Elena teaches in Kayasik still, though she looks 60 now despite being only 28. She's seen 3 winters of resurrection, watched her students' dead relatives return for seasons of impossible life. She's learned to accept what the villagers have always known. Some places remember, some lands don't let go, and love's price can be measured in stolen years. When she dies, and she will die young, her body worn out by the cost of other people's resurrections, she wonders if the land will remember her too. Will she return each winter, walking out of the snow to teach another generation? The villagers think so. They tell her she's part of Kayasik now, woven into the memory of the land itself. And sometimes, in the depths of polar night, she thinks that might not be so terrible after all. Story 4. The Thing in the Aurora. Jack Morrison had photographed the northern lights hundreds of times during his 3 years living in Fairbanks. But the display on February 14th of 2024 was extraordinary. Ribbons of green, purple, and red danced across the entire sky with an intensity he'd never witnessed. He drove 90 minutes north on the Steese Highway to get away from city lights, setting up his camera equipment in the parking lot of a closed roadside campground. The aurora writhed and pulsed, far more active than any he'd documented. Jack adjusted his camera settings, taking long exposures that captured the light's ethereal beauty. Through his viewfinder, the aurora looked like living things, serpents of light twisting through the upper atmosphere. Then he noticed something in the photographs that wasn't visible to the naked eye. In every image there was a shape within the lights, not a pattern or random formation, but a distinct silhouette that remained consistent across multiple exposures. It was roughly humanoid but impossibly large, perhaps 300 feet tall, with limbs that seemed to bend in too many places. The figure appeared to be moving through the aurora like a swimmer through water. Jack reviewed his images carefully. The shape was there in every single shot, always in slightly different positions, always maintaining the same basic form. He looked up at the actual aurora with his eyes. He saw nothing but lights. But through the camera, the figure was unmistakable. He took dozens more photographs over the next 2 hours. The shape became clearer in each image, more defined, as though it was drawing closer to Earth. Details emerged. What might have been a face, elongated and eyeless, a mouth opened impossibly wide, arms that stretched and contracted like elastic, a body that flickered in and out of visibility as the aurora pulsed. Around midnight, the aurora intensified further, brightening until Jack could read his notes in the green glow. And for the first time, he saw the shape with his naked eyes. It was descending, pulling itself down from the upper atmosphere, using the aurora itself like a rope. The figure was massive beyond comprehension, its head still in the ionosphere while its reaching limbs stretched down toward the ground. Jack's scientific mind tried to rationalize what he was seeing. Mass hallucination from low oxygen at altitude. Some atmospheric phenomenon he didn't understand. But his camera was capturing the same thing his eyes saw, and cameras didn't hallucinate. The shape was real, or real enough to be photographed. He should have left then, should have packed his gear and driven back to civilization. Instead, professional instinct and morbid curiosity kept him shooting. This was the photograph of a lifetime, proof of something beyond human understanding. His name would be famous. Scientists would study his work for generations. The shape touched ground approximately 200 yards from his position. Where it made contact, the snow flash froze, turning from powder to solid ice in an instant. The aurora swirled around the figure like a cloak, and Jack finally understood what he was seeing. This wasn't a creature traveling through the northern lights. The aurora itself was the creature, the lights were its substance, and what Jack saw was simply the form it chose to take when manifesting in three-dimensional space. It had no face in any conventional sense, just a hollow space where a face should be, filled with more aurora. The glow from its interior was cold and blue-white, entirely different from the green and purple of its body. When it moved, the motion was fluid but wrong, like watching a video played at the wrong speed. Jack's camera shutter clicked frantically. He couldn't stop shooting even as his hands began to shake. The being turned toward him, and though it had no eyes, he felt its attention lock onto his position. The aurora brightened around it, intensifying until Jack had to shield his eyes. Then it spoke. Not in words or sounds, but directly into his mind. The communication was pure concept and emotion, overwhelming his consciousness with meaning that bypassed language entirely. Jack understood it was ancient, older than human presence in Alaska, perhaps older than humanity itself. It lived in the magnetic fields and solar winds, descending to Earth only when conditions allowed. "Why do you capture my image?" the concept voice demanded. "Why do you try to hold what should remain ephemeral?" Jack tried to respond, but his voice wouldn't work. The being's presence was suppressing his ability to form words. Instead, his thoughts answered involuntarily. "I want to prove you exist. I want to show the world." The aurora being rippled with something that might have been amusement or anger. Prove? The world chose to forget us centuries ago. Your ancestors saw us and knew. They made treaties, showed respect, left offerings at sacred sites. But modern humans became blind, seeing only natural phenomena where we danced. You seek to force remembrance. That is forbidden. Jack felt his camera grow hot in his hands. The aurora being was doing something to it, to the memory cards, to the digital information stored within. The images he'd taken were corrupting, the data degrading into random noise. His life's work, his proof vanishing in real time. "No!" Jack shouted, finding his voice. "You can't! The world needs to know!" "The world needs nothing," the being responded. You need validation, recognition, fame. Your need endangers all your kind. If you prove us to the blind world, they will seek us, they will hunt us. They will try to capture and study and destroy what they cannot understand. We have survived by remaining hidden in plain sight, dismissed as science and weather. You would undo millennia of careful obscurement. The aurora intensified further, and Jack realized with horror that the being was expanding, growing larger as it drew more magnetic energy from the upper atmosphere. It loomed over him now, 300 feet tall and still growing, a titan of living light that could crush him without effort. "I'm sorry," Jack whispered. "I'll delete everything. I'll never tell anyone, just let me go." Delete what has already been seen? Unlearn what has been learned? That is not how memory works, human. The being reached down with one elongated limb. Where it touched, frost formed instantly. It placed what might have been a hand on Jack's head. Cold invaded his skull. Not the cold of winter or ice, but the absolute cold of deep space, of the void between stars where the aurora itself was born. Jack felt his memories freezing, specific recollections crystallizing and then shattering. The being was removing his knowledge of its existence, carefully excising every thought and image related to what he'd witnessed. But the process wasn't clean. Memories don't exist in isolation. They connect to everything else in a mind. To remove one memory, others had to be damaged. Jack felt pieces of himself disappearing. His daughter's 5th birthday. the recipe for his grandmother's bread, the name of his first love, his college thesis. Random precious pieces of his identity turned to frost and broke apart. "Stop," he tried to say, but the word came out wrong. The connections between thought and language disrupted. "Please." "Nah." The being completed its work and withdrew. Jack collapsed in the snow, his camera destroyed, his mind shattered like dropped glass. The aurora faded as the being ascended back into the ionosphere, taking its impossible form with it. Within minutes, only ordinary northern lights remained, beautiful but no longer alive. A passing truck driver found Jack at dawn, unresponsive and nearly frozen. The man had been driving all night and saw Jack's vehicle still parked at the closed campground. Jack was alive but catatonic, staring at nothing, occasionally mumbling words that didn't form coherent sentences. At the hospital in Fairbanks, doctors diagnosed severe frostbite, hypothermia, and what appeared to be a traumatic brain injury, though they could find no physical evidence of head trauma. More concerning was the extensive memory loss. Jack couldn't remember his own name for 3 days. His language functions were severely impaired. He had to relearn basic concepts like time, numbers, and spatial relationships. His camera was found beside him, completely destroyed as though it had been microwaved. Every electronic component was fused. The memory cards were blank, not just erased, but physically altered at the molecular level according to the data recovery specialists. Whatever had been on them was gone beyond any possibility of retrieval. Jack's recovery took months. Speech therapy, occupational therapy, cognitive rehabilitation. He regained most of his functions eventually, though gaps remained in his memory. Entire years of his life were missing. He couldn't remember his daughter's childhood, his wedding, the deaths of his parents. Those memories were simply gone, replaced with frost-damaged emptiness. He also couldn't remember why he'd driven to that particular location on that particular night. Hospital records showed he'd suffered his injuries sometime around midnight on February 14th, but Jack had no recollection of the preceding evening. The last thing he remembered clearly was eating dinner on February 13th. Everything after that was blank until waking in the hospital. But sometimes, on nights when the aurora danced, Jack felt an inexplicable dread. He'd look up at the northern lights and feel certain he was seeing something more than natural phenomena. His hands would shake, his heart would race, and he'd retreat indoors, closing curtains and avoiding windows until the lights faded. He never understood why the aurora terrified him. The doctors said it was probably a phobia developed from trauma, his mind associating the lights with whatever accident had caused his injuries. They suggested exposure therapy, encouraging him to view the aurora until his fear response normalized. Jack refused. On some instinctive level deeper than conscious memory, he knew the lights were dangerous. Something lived in them, something vast and ancient and merciless. Something that had touched his mind and taken pieces of his soul. The knowledge was gone, but the primal fear remained, an emotional echo of memories that no longer existed. He moved to Seattle 6 months after his release from the hospital, putting as much distance as possible between himself and Alaska's far north. He never photographed the aurora again. He never even looked at pictures of the northern lights without feeling nauseous. His career as a nature photographer ended, replaced by a job in commercial real estate photography where the sky was never dark enough for the aurora to appear. And on clear winter nights when conditions were right, faint northern lights occasionally appeared over Seattle's northern horizon. When that happened, Jack would suffer from inexplicable nightmares. He'd dream of giants in the sky, of cold that burned like fire, of knowledge being torn from his mind. He'd wake screaming, unable to articulate what frightened him. His doctors adjusted his medications. His therapist explored his childhood for buried trauma. No one suspected the truth. that Jack Morrison had proof of something beyond human understanding, and that proof had been violently removed from his mind, leaving only the scar tissue of fear behind. The aurora still dances over Alaska, beautiful and terrifying, hiding its true nature behind science and spectacle. And sometimes, when the solar wind is strong, the lights take on shapes that cameras can almost capture, figures that seem to move with purpose rather than random magnetic flux. But no one looks closely anymore. No one sees what the lights truly are, except for those rare few who've drawn the aurora's attention, who've had their proof taken and their memories destroyed. They see. They remember in ways that bypass conscious thought, and they know enough to stay afraid, to never look too closely at the dancing lights, to never seek what should remain forever hidden in the cold magnetic currents of the Arctic sky. Story 5. The Crawl Space. Daniel Reeves purchased the foreclosed house in Homer for $40,000 below market value in September of 2022. The realtor had been upfront about its history. The previous owners had abandoned it suddenly in 2019, walking away from their mortgage and possessions. No forwarding address, no explanation. The bank eventually seized the property, which sat empty for 3 years before Daniel found it. Why did they leave? Daniel asked, touring the 2-story cabin with its stunning view of Kachamak Bay. The realtor shrugged. The paperwork doesn't say. But houses this nice don't get abandoned for no reason. Check it thoroughly before you buy. Daniel did check. He hired inspectors who found only minor issues: aging roof, old plumbing, a crawl space with insufficient vapor barrier. Nothing explained why the previous owners had fled. Daniel rationalized that they'd probably had financial troubles or family emergencies. He was getting a beautiful home for a fraction of its worth. He moved in on October 1st, excited to start his new life in Alaska. Daniel was a freelance software developer who could work from anywhere, and he'd chosen Homer for its natural beauty and artist community. The house had plenty of space for his office, and the view was inspiring. The first night, he heard scratching sounds from below the floor. Daniel assumed mice, or possibly a small animal that had gotten into the crawl space during the house's vacancy. He made a note to set traps, but didn't worry much about it. Old houses always had some wildlife issues. The scratching continued nightly, always starting around 2 a.m. and lasting until dawn. After a week of interrupted sleep, Daniel decided to investigate the crawl space himself, rather than wait for an exterminator. On October 8th, he opened the access panel in his utility room and squeezed into the narrow space beneath his house. His flashlight revealed a typical crawl space: dirt floor, support posts, plumbing runs, electrical conduit, and scratches. The wooden underside of his floor was covered in scratch marks, thousands of them concentrated beneath his bedroom. They were too large for mice, too deliberate in their pattern. Something had been clawing at the floor from beneath, trying to get through. Daniel examined the scratches closely. They were fresh, the exposed wood still light-colored rather than aged. Whatever made them had been active recently, perhaps only in the days since he'd moved in. But the scratches went deep, some nearly penetrating the 3/4-inch plywood floor. The creature must have been clawing for hours, perhaps days. He searched the entire crawl space but found no animal tracks, no droppings, no nests. Just the scratches beneath his bedroom, and as he looked more carefully, words carved into the support posts. Not carved casually, but gouged, deep individual letters 6 inches tall. Stay out, get out, it knows don't sleep. Daniel backed out of the crawl space quickly, his heart pounding. This wasn't animal damage. The previous owners had carved those warnings. But warnings about what? He examined the crawl space entrance but found no lock or barrier. Nothing preventing something from emerging into the house. That night, the scratching resumed at 2 a.m. Daniel lay in bed listening to the sound of claws or nails dragging across wood directly beneath him. Back and forth, methodical and purposeful. He turned on every light in the house and sat in his living room until dawn, unwilling to sleep above whatever made that sound. In the morning, exhausted and rattled, Daniel pulled up the carpet in his bedroom. The plywood beneath was damaged, splintered by countless scratches that had nearly broken through in several places. Whatever was down there was trying to reach him specifically, focusing its efforts on the room where he slept. He called a wildlife control company. The technician spent an hour in the crawl space with cameras and monitoring equipment. When he emerged, his expression was troubled. "Mr. Reeves, I can't find any animal sign down there. No tracks, no scat, nothing. But those scratches are real and they're recent. And there's something else. Did you know there used to be a room down there?" "A room? It's a crawl space. There's barely 3 feet of clearance." The technician showed him photos on his camera. In the far corner of the crawl space, hidden behind the furnace, was a bricked-up doorway. The bricks were old, maybe original to the house's construction in 1978, but someone had reinforced them recently with concrete and metal bars. "Someone really didn't want that door opened," the technician said. "And I found these." He showed more photos. Scratches covered the brickwork, different from the floor scratches. These came from the other side of the wall, from whatever was sealed behind it. Something had been clawing at the bricks from inside that sealed room, trying to get out. Daniel paid the technician and stood in his house trying to decide what to do. Every rational instinct told him to leave, to abandon this property just like the previous owners had. But he'd invested everything in this house. He couldn't just walk away. Instead, he researched the property's history. The house was built by a couple named Richard and Evelyn Nash in 1978. They lived there for 36 years before both dying in a car accident in 2014. The house sat empty for 2 years before being sold to the family that eventually abandoned it in 2019. Daniel found an obituary for Richard Nash. He'd been a mining engineer who'd worked on various projects across Alaska. The obituary mentioned he'd been a devoted husband, skilled craftsman, and a man who understood the importance of containing the past. Strange phrasing. What past? Contained how? That night, Daniel decided to sleep in his car. He packed a bag and prepared to leave around midnight, but as he headed for the door, he heard a voice from the crawl space access panel. Faint, distorted, but unmistakably words. "Daniel, don't leave. Let me out. I've been waiting so long." He froze. The voice was dry, ancient, inhuman in its quality, yet forming perfect English. "I know you hear me, Daniel. I heard you up there, walking, breathing, sleeping. You're so close. Just open the door. Remove the bricks. Let me out. I promise I'll leave. I promise I'll go. I just need to get out." Daniel ran. He didn't pack, didn't take his things, just fled to his car and drove into town. He spent the night in a hotel trying to convince himself he'd imagined the voice. But he knew he hadn't. Something was sealed beneath his house, something aware and desperate and profoundly wrong. He contacted a local historian the next morning. The woman named Margaret knew about the Nash house. "Richard Nash was involved in the Taku mine incident," she explained. "Back in the 70s, there was a copper mine about 40 miles from here. Standard operation, nothing unusual. Until they broke through into a natural cave system that shouldn't have existed according to the geological surveys." "What was in the caves?" Daniel asked. Margaret hesitated. "The official story is nothing. Just empty caves. But the miners who went in came back changed. All 12 of them quit within a week. Most moved out of Alaska entirely, and Richard Nash, who was the surveying engineer, helped seal the caves permanently. Concrete, steel, the works. The mine was abandoned." "What did they find?" They never said officially, but I talked to one of the miners years later before he died. He told me they found something living in those caves. Not an animal, something else. He said it was like a person, but not a person, something that had been down there in the dark for thousands of years. It could talk, could think, could remember, and it wanted out desperately. They sealed it in, all of them agreeing never to speak of it. Daniel felt cold. Richard Nash brought something back, didn't he? From the caves. Margaret nodded slowly. That's always been the rumor, that he couldn't seal all of them, that one of them somehow followed him or part of one did. And when he built his house, he built it over a pit where he sealed it, keeping it contained under his own home so he could watch it. When he died, there was no one to maintain the seal. Daniel returned to his house that afternoon armed with Margaret's information and a terrible resolve. He couldn't leave this thing sealed beneath a house he owned. If he abandoned the property, eventually someone else would move in, children perhaps. And the thing would keep clawing, keep calling out, until someone weak or foolish opened that door. He went into the crawl space with tools and fresh concrete. He would reinforce the seal, make it permanent beyond any possibility of breach. As he worked, the voice called to him constantly. Daniel, please. I've been here since 1978, 44 years in the dark. Richard promised he'd release me eventually. He lied. He died and left me here. You don't understand what it's like, the hunger, the darkness, the endless time. Just remove one brick. Just see what I am. You'll understand. You'll help me. Daniel worked in silence, mixing concrete, reinforcing the brick with steel mesh and rebar. The scratching intensified, becoming frantic. The thing behind the wall was throwing itself against the barrier, sensing its last chance slipping away. No, you can't. I'll die here. Is that what you want to? Murder something you don't even understand. I'm alive, Daniel. I think, I feel, I suffer. You're condemning me to eternal imprisonment. How is that justice? Daniel finished his work and backed away. The voice continued, pleading, threatening, bargaining. He sealed the crawlspace access panel with screws and steel plate, making it impossible to open without power tools. Then he listed the house for sale, pricing it low for a quick transaction. The voice followed him through the floors. He heard it in his bedroom, his kitchen, his bathroom. Everywhere he went, the thin, desperate voice called up from below. Daniel, I forgive you. Just come back. Just talk to me. 44 years alone. Please, I'm so hungry, so tired. Just one conversation, just acknowledgement that I exist. Daniel moved out after 3 days, taking only his essential possessions. He slept in his car while waiting for the house to sell. It took 6 weeks to find a buyer, a young couple from Anchorage looking for their first home. Daniel told them nothing about the crawlspace, about the sealed room, about the voice that begged and threatened and promised in the dark beneath their feet. He signed the papers and left Homer in December of 2022, moving to Juneau, where he rented a modern apartment in a building with no crawl space, no basement, nothing but concrete slab beneath his feet. He tried to forget, tried to convince himself he'd done the right thing, but sometimes, late at night, he still heard the voice. Not through floors this time, but in his mind, in his dreams, a thin and desperate whisper. You left me here. You sealed me forever. Now I'm part of you. I'll never let you forget. Every house you enter, every floor you walk on, you'll wonder if I'm beneath. You'll wonder if something like me is under there, sealed away, slowly starving in the dark. You'll never forget what you did to me. Daniel Reeves has lived in 7 different apartments in the past 2 years, never staying anywhere more than 4 months. He can't sleep without checking under his bed, examining floors for scratches, listening for sounds that shouldn't exist. The thing in the crawlspace is still sealed beneath the house in Homer, still alive if such a word applies, still calling out to anyone who might listen. And the new owners, the young couple who bought the house, they've started hearing scratches at night. But they assume it's mice, just mice, nothing more. They haven't opened the crawl space yet. Haven't seen the warnings carved in the support posts. Haven't heard the voice that calls their names in the darkest hours. But they will. Eventually, curiosity or necessity will drive them down there, and when they see the reinforced brick wall, when they wonder what's behind it, the voice will start its work again. Pleading, promising, slowly eroding their resistance until someone someday removes just one brick. Just one brick to see what lies behind. That's all it needs. One brick, one gap, one moment of weakness. The thing sealed beneath has patience. It's had 46 years to develop patience. It can wait 46 more if necessary. After all, time means nothing in the dark. And it has nothing but time. Story 6. The Tracking Station. Melissa Torres accepted the contract position at the Poker Flat Research Range north of Fairbanks in November of 2023. The facility launched sounding rockets to study the upper atmosphere and aurora, and Melissa's expertise in telemetry systems made her ideal for a 6-month technical upgrade project. She'd be working mostly alone in the tracking station, a small building isolated from the main complex where receivers monitored rocket data. The job paid well, included housing, and offered the solitude Melissa craved after her divorce. She arrived during the first week of November, just as polar night began settling over the interior. The facility manager, a quiet man named Howard, showed her the tracking station and its systems. "Pretty straightforward," he said. "Monitor the receivers, log any transmissions, perform routine maintenance. During active launches, you'll be busy, but those only happen once or twice a month. Rest of the time, you'll be alone with the equipment." "What about the old system?" Melissa asked, pointing to a bank of vintage receivers in the corner, clearly decades old and covered in dust. Howard frowned. "Those are decommissioned. From the 70s. They used to track something called the HARP transmissions before HARP went offline. Just ignore them. We keep them for historical purposes, but they don't connect to anything anymore." Melissa settled into her routine. Most days she was the only person at the tracking station, arriving before dawn and leaving after dark, though during polar night those terms lost meaning. The facility was peaceful, the equipment functioned smoothly, and she enjoyed the technical work. The old receivers activated on November 18th. Melissa was performing calibration checks when she heard a crackle from the corner where the decommissioned equipment sat. One of the vintage receivers had lit up, its needles moving, its speakers emitting static. She walked over, puzzled. The unit wasn't connected to external power it shouldn't have been capable of activating. Yet there it was, clearly receiving something. Melissa checked the frequency display. 3.39 MHz, well within the HF band. She adjusted the tuning, clearing up the static, and heard a voice. "Poker Flat Tracking, this is Raven 7 requesting telemetry confirmation. We've lost visual in the ionospheric density layer. Can you confirm our altitude?" Melissa grabbed the receiver's microphone instinctively, then stopped. This equipment wasn't connected to anything. It couldn't transmit or receive. Yet the voice was clear, professional, with the calm tone of an experienced pilot or mission specialist. She checked the facility logs. There were no launches scheduled for today. No rockets in flight, no reason for anyone to be calling for telemetry. She keyed her radio to the main facility. "Howard, this is Melissa. Are we tracking anything right now? I'm picking up a call for telemetry on the old receivers." Howard's response crackled back. "Negative. No active flights. Nothing scheduled until December 3rd. What frequency are you on?" 3.39 MHz. A long pause. "Melissa, that's the old HARP frequency. Nothing transmits on that anymore. HARP shut down in 2014. "Well, someone's transmitting. I've got a clear voice asking for altitude confirmation. Call sign Raven 7. Another pause, longer this time. I'll be right over. While Melissa waited, the voice continued. Poker Flat Raven 7, our instrumentation is failing. External temperature is dropping past safety margins. We're showing negative 280 degrees Fahrenheit. That can't be correct. Please confirm. Melissa couldn't help herself. She keyed the old microphone. Raven 7, this is Poker Flat tracking. What's your current altitude? Static then. Poker Flat, thank God we're at 140 miles approximate. But something's wrong. We can see the curvature of Earth, we can see stars, but there's something else up here. Something that shouldn't exist. It's massive, bigger than our rocket, and it's moving toward us. Howard burst into the tracking station, breathing hard. What are you doing? Don't respond to that. Why not? Someone's in trouble. Howard pulled her away from the microphone. Because Raven 7 doesn't exist. Not anymore. It was an experimental-sounding rocket we launched in March of 1974. It reached an altitude of 143 miles, then lost telemetry. The payload was never recovered. Whatever you're hearing, it's not real. Melissa stared at the receiver. The voice continued, It's surrounding us. God, it's so big. We're being engulfed. Poker Flat, can you see this on your instruments? The temperature is falling. Negative 300. Negative 400. How is this possible? We're freezing. The hull is contracting. Everything's shutting down. That's the original transmission, Howard said quietly. From 49 years ago. The crew, if you can call 2 payload specialists a crew, they reported something impossible. Temperatures that couldn't exist, something in the upper atmosphere that shouldn't have been there. Then the transmission cut off. They and the rocket vanished. But I'm hearing it now, in real time. You're hearing it again. The old receivers, sometimes they pick up historical transmissions. Don't ask me how. Physics doesn't explain it. But every few years, on certain nights when the aurora is strong, these receivers activate and play back old launches. Especially Raven 7. Especially that last transmission. Melissa watched the needles dance on the old equipment. That doesn't make sense. Radio waves dissipate. They don't just replay years later. I know, but this is Alaska. This is the Aurora Zone, and stranger things happen here than you'll find in textbooks. Just let it finish. Don't respond. It's not a live communication, even though it sounds like one. The voice from Raven 7 became desperate. We're encased, completely surrounded. It's not ice, it's not matter, it's something else. The cold is inside the cabin now. My hands, I can't feel my hands. Rodriguez isn't responding. God, I can see through him. His body is turning transparent. I'm looking at the earth through his chest. What is this? What's happening to us? Melissa felt her blood run cold. She looked at Howard. What did they encounter up there? Nobody knows. The official report says equipment malfunction caused erroneous readings and crew disorientation. But every scientist who worked on Raven 7 back then, they all quietly left atmospheric research within 5 years. None of them ever spoke publicly about what happened. The transmission continued. I'm freezing solid, my blood is stopping, but I'm still conscious. How am I still conscious? My heart isn't beating, but I'm still thinking. I can see all of time spread out below me. Earth's rotation is visible. I'm watching decades pass in seconds. Poker Flat, I can see you in there. I can see the technician listening to this. I can see her fear. Melissa jerked back from the receiver. It can't see me. That's impossible. It's not really seeing you, Howard said, but he didn't sound convinced. It's just what the crew member said back in '74, and you're interpreting it as personal because you're the one listening. The voice spoke directly to her. Melissa Torres, divorced, hiding in Alaska from a life that fell apart. You think this place is remote enough to escape your problems, but you're hearing me because you were meant to. Because what happened to us up here, it's connected to down there. The cold above and the cold below, they're the same cold. The thing that took us exists at the edge of temperature's bottom limit, and it can reach through time and space to anywhere that cold touches. Howard grabbed his radio. I'm calling this in. This isn't normal even for the repeating transmissions. But Melissa couldn't stop listening. The voice continued, We're part of it now. Rodriguez and I, we've been absorbed into the cold. We exist at all times simultaneously, frozen in the moment of our death, but aware of everything after. I've watched 49 years pass, Melissa. I've seen every person who listened to this transmission. I've seen what becomes of them. What becomes of them? Melissa whispered. The cold marks them. Once you've heard us, once you've felt the fear we felt, you carry a piece of that absolute zero inside you. It grows slowly. Most people don't notice for months, but eventually you'll feel it. A coldness that comes from within that no external heat can touch. It's the temperature of the void we encountered, and it never goes away. Howard was shouting into his radio, demanding assistance, but Melissa couldn't focus on his words. The transmission held her complete attention. You'll start seeing frost form on your breath. Even in warm rooms, your fingers and toes will ache with cold that isn't there. And eventually, years from now, or maybe just months, you'll feel the pull. The cold calling you upward. You'll have dreams of ascending, of rising into the ionosphere where we wait. Some who've heard this transmission have jumped from buildings, convinced they could fly up to meet us. Others have frozen to death in their homes despite working heaters, their bodies somehow reaching temperatures that shouldn't be survivable. They all come to us eventually, Melissa. Everyone who truly listens. Turn it off, Howard demanded, reaching for the equipment. The voice spoke faster, urgent. The cold is patient. The cold is eternal. What we found up here exists at the quantum level, in the spaces between atoms where temperature approaches absolute zero. It's always been there, waiting. The aurora is its manifestation, its way of reaching into the thermal world. Every green curtain you see is a finger of that vast cold intelligence, reaching down, searching for awareness it can touch. Melissa felt her skin prickling. The temperature in the tracking station hadn't changed according to the thermometer, but she felt frozen. Her breath came out in visible clouds now, impossible in the heated building. You see, the voice said, it's starting already. The cold recognizes you now. You've made contact by listening. Most people hear and dismiss, but you believed. You felt fear. Fear opens the door. And now you're marked. Howard physically pulled Melissa away from the receivers and shut down their power. The transmission cut off mid-sentence. The old equipment went dark and silent. But the frost remained in the air. Melissa's breath still visible in clouds of frozen moisture. We need to get you to medical, Howard said. You're hyperventilating. That's why you're seeing your breath. It's just panic. But Melissa felt the cold inside her chest, spreading through her veins like ice water. She'd made contact with something that existed beyond normal physical limits, something that had claimed the Raven 7 crew in 1974 and had been waiting decades for someone else to truly listen. The next 3 months were agony. Melissa completed her contract because she needed the money, but every day the cold inside her grew worse. She wore thermal layers even in heated rooms. Her body temperature, according to medical thermometers, remained normal. But she felt frozen from within, as though her core was approaching absolute zero. She researched Raven 7 obsessively. The crew members, James Reyes and Miguel Rodriguez, had been declared dead in absentia after the rocket's loss. No bodies recovered, no wreckage found. But Melissa discovered something the official reports omitted. 3 previous technicians who'd heard the repeating transmission had died in the years since 1974. One from hypothermia in his own apartment despite a working heater. One fell to his death from a radio tower, witnesses saying he seemed to be climbing towards something in the sky. One simply vanished during a winter hike, his tracks leading to the edge of a frozen lake and then stopping. Melissa left Alaska when her contract ended in May of 2024. She moved to Phoenix, Arizona, seeking heat that might counteract the cold. It didn't help. She was freezing in 110-degree summer temperatures, wearing winter coats and running space heaters while her neighbors suffered in the desert heat. The dreams came next. She'd find herself floating in space, looking down at Earth, watching time pass at impossible speeds. She could see the aurora from above, could see the green curtains were just the visible portion of something enormous, something that existed primarily in dimensions humans couldn't perceive. And she could see the Raven 7 crew, their bodies frozen but their minds still active, trapped in the moment of their death for eternity. Part of the vast cold intelligence that lived at the edge of absolute zero. They called to her in these dreams. "Join us, Melissa. The cold has marked you. Fighting it only prolongs the fear. Embrace it. Rise up to meet us. It's peaceful here once you stop resisting. No pain, no heartache, no divorce or failure or disappointment. Just the eternal cold and the clarity it brings." Melissa Torres was found dead in her Phoenix apartment on August 7, 2024. The medical examiner's report listed cause of death as hypothermia, impossible given that the apartment's internal temperature was 83 degrees Fahrenheit. Her body was frozen solid, internal organs crystallized, skin blue and rigid. But strangest of all, her body temperature at time of death was estimated to have been around negative 200 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to liquefy oxygen. The police found her journals filled with increasingly erratic entries about hearing transmissions, feeling cold from within, and seeing figures in the aurora, even though Aurora Borealis doesn't appear over Phoenix. The final entry, written the night she died, read, "I can see them now. Raven 7 hovering just beyond my window. They're beautiful in their frozen state, preserved perfectly in the cold that killed them. They're right. The cold is peace. I'm ready to ascend. I'm ready to join them in the ionosphere, to become part of the vast cold intelligence that waits in the spaces between atoms. I'm not afraid anymore. I'm just cold. So very, very cold. And soon I'll be warm again in the way they're warm, in the absolute zero where all motion stops and peace. Eternal." The old receivers at Poker Flat Research Range still activate occasionally, playing back transmissions from decades past. Raven 7's final broadcast comes through sometimes, especially during strong auroral activity. But now, technicians who monitor the frequency report hearing 3 voices instead of 2. Reyes, Rodriguez, and a woman who introduces herself as Melissa Torres, warning new listeners about the cold that waits in the upper atmosphere, the intelligence that marks those who truly hear, the absolute zero that claims those who make contact. The tracking station was closed in late 2024. Too many technicians refusing to work there, too many reports of impossible cold. Too many people hearing voices that shouldn't exist. The old receivers were destroyed, melted down, their components scattered. But it didn't matter. The transmissions continue, carried on frequencies that bypass physical equipment, reaching directly into the minds of anyone who works too long in the aurora zone. Anyone who listens too carefully to the silence of the Arctic night. Because the cold that claimed Raven 7 doesn't need receivers to broadcast. It exists in the fabric of low-temperature physics itself, and anyone who touches true cold, who feels it deeply enough, can hear the voices calling from the edge of absolute zero, inviting them to rise up and join the frozen consciousness that waits in the ionosphere above Alaska. Story 7. The Cartographer. Nathan Wolfe had been mapping Alaska's remote regions for the U.S. Geological Survey for 8 years when he received the assignment that would change his life. In June of 2022, he was tasked with updating topographical maps of a region northeast of McGrath, approximately 200 square miles of wilderness that hadn't been surveyed since 1967. The old maps showed standard features: rivers, elevation contours, vegetation zones. But modern satellite imaging revealed discrepancies that needed ground truthing. Nathan flew into the region with a bush pilot named Ray, landing on a gravel bar alongside the Kuskokwim River. He'd spend 4 weeks alone, hiking the territory, taking measurements, validating what satellites suggested and correcting what they missed. He had GPS, satellite communicator, camping gear, and extensive experience in backcountry work. It should have been routine. The first 2 weeks proceeded normally. Nathan hiked approximately 12 miles daily, recording waypoints, taking photographs, and noting features for his maps. The region was stunning: dense spruce forests, braided river valleys, foothills leading to the Alaska Range in the distance. He saw plenty of wildlife: moose, bears, eagles, but no signs of human presence. The nearest village was 40 miles away. On day 15, June 21st, the summer solstice, Nathan discovered something that wasn't on any map. He'd been following a creek upstream when he noticed the water seemed to vanish. The stream didn't gradually disappear through seepage or evaporation. It simply ended abruptly, flowing into what appeared to be a cave entrance partially hidden by alder bushes. Nathan investigated carefully. The cave opening was approximately 6 feet high and 4 feet wide, natural granite formation. His flashlight revealed it extended back at least 30 feet before turning. Running water into underground systems wasn't unusual, but the old maps showed no karst geology in this area. Granite doesn't typically form extensive cave systems. Professional curiosity drove him to explore. He marked the entrance with GPS coordinates and ventured inside. The cave tunnel was smooth, almost artificially so, descending at a gentle angle. After 50 feet, it opened into a larger chamber, perhaps 20 feet across. Nathan's flashlight beam swept the space and stopped on something impossible. A village, underground. Complete with structures. They weren't recent. The buildings were constructed from stone and appeared ancient, architectural style, unlike anything Nathan had seen before. Not native Alaskan design, not Russian influence, nothing he recognized. The structures were dome-shaped, about 8 feet high, with no visible doors or windows. Approximately 20 buildings arranged in a circular pattern around a central plaza. Nathan's archaeological training was limited, but he knew this was significant. He photographed everything, documenting the layout meticulously. The stone used in construction was smooth, almost glassy, with strange patterns etched into surfaces. Not decorative, the patterns were too precise, too mathematical. They reminded Nathan of topographical maps, actually, elevation contours and grid references, but depicting terrain he didn't recognize. He examined one of the dome structures closely. The stone was seamless, no mortar or joints visible. It was as though each building had been carved from a single piece of rock. Nathan ran his hand over the surface and felt vibration, a subtle humming that seemed to come from within the stone itself. Then the patterns began moving. Nathan jerked his hand back. The etched lines on the building's surface were rearranging themselves, flowing like liquid through the solid stone, forming new patterns. He watched in stunned disbelief as the etchings created an image, a map of the area above, perfectly accurate, showing the river, the forest, and his own position marked with a pulsing point of light. "What the hell?" Nathan whispered. The map zoomed out, showing broader terrain, then broader still, until it displayed all of Alaska, then North America, then Earth from space. The patterns continued shifting, showing the planet's rotation, the movement of tectonic plates, the ebb and flow of ice ages. Nathan was watching geological time passing, millions of years compressed into seconds, displayed through etchings in stone that moved like living things. A voice spoke in his mind, not heard but understood. Observer, cataloger, one who makes maps. You understand representation. You understand the compression of vast space into symbols. Good. We have waited for one who understands. Nathan stumbled backward. The voice didn't feel malicious, but it was utterly alien, intelligence structured nothing like human thought. Who are you? He said aloud. We are cartographers. We map. We catalog. We compress reality into symbols for storage. We have done this for longer than your species has existed. We have mapped Earth through its many configurations. We remember when these mountains were ocean floor. We remember when ice covered continents. We store these maps. Nathan looked around the chamber with new understanding. This wasn't a village. It was a library. Each dome structure was a storage unit containing maps, geological records spanning incomprehensible time. You're not human, he said unnecessarily. Correct. We existed before humans. We will exist after. We are patient. We are thorough. We map everything. That is our function. That is our nature. Why are you here? Underground in Alaska? Alaska is geologically active. Much change occurs here on rapid timescales. Ice advances and retreats. Mountains rise. Rivers shift. Interesting to map. Useful data. We maintain our archive here beneath the surface, where your kind rarely ventures. Nathan's scientist mind raced. This was first contact with non-human intelligence, but an intelligence so fundamentally different from humanity that communication was barely possible. Are there others of you? Elsewhere? Many others. Distributed globally. Some underwater, some deep underground, one on your moon. We have been mapping your planet for 17 million years. We map other planets also. Mapping is eternal work. Reality always changes. Records must be maintained. Nathan felt dizzy. Why are you telling me this? Why reveal yourselves? Because you map also. You understand the value of accurate records. We wish to share data. Your maps are crude, limited to surface features, brief time spans. But your symbols are efficient. Your digital encoding is interesting. We wish to collaborate. You will take our maps to your people. You will tell them what exists here. Scientific exchange will begin. My people won't believe me. You have proof, your photographs, your GPS coordinates. Others will come. They will excavate. They will study. Eventually, they will understand. Exchange will occur. We are patient. We have waited 17 million years. We can wait longer. The patterns on the buildings intensified, projections forming in the air of the chamber. Nathan saw maps beyond human comprehension. Topographical surveys of Earth as it had appeared during the Cretaceous period, during the formation of Pangaea, during the Cambrian explosion. He saw maps of continental drift, ocean current changes, atmospheric composition variations across billions of years. And then he saw maps of the future, projections based on current geological trends showing how Alaska would transform over the next million years. New mountains rising, glaciers advancing and retreating in cycles, the eventual subduction of the Pacific plate causing massive earthquakes that would reshape the coast. This is too much, Nathan said, his mind struggling to process the information flood. I can't understand all of this. You don't need to understand. Only to communicate that we exist, that we have records humanity lacks, that collaboration is possible. Take samples, take measurements, return with others, begin the exchange. Nathan spent 3 more hours in the chamber documenting everything he could. He took rock samples from the buildings, careful photographs of the moving patterns, video of the projections. When he finally emerged, his head throbbed with sensory overload. He returned to the cave entrance the next day with better equipment, lighting, surveying tools, sample containers. The cave was still there, the underground chamber still accessible, but the buildings were gone, not destroyed or collapsed, simply absent. The chamber was empty natural granite, no structures, no etchings, no evidence anything had existed there. Nathan searched frantically. He checked his GPS coordinates repeatedly, confirming this was the correct location. But the cartographer archive had vanished as though it never existed. Only his photographs, video, and rock samples remained as proof of what he'd witnessed. Except when he reviewed his documentation that evening, all of it had changed. The photographs showed an empty cave. The video was just footage of bare rock walls. Even his field notes had altered, the handwritten descriptions now reading as standard geological observations with no mention of structures or alien intelligence. Nathan felt panic rising. How could physical records change? He checked his rock samples. They looked like ordinary granite, no unusual properties. He'd either hallucinated the entire experience or something had retroactively erased evidence of the encounter. That night he dreamed of maps. Not normal dreams, but something more vivid, more real. He saw himself from above, a moving point of light on a topographical representation of Alaska. Then the map pulled back, showing broader context, then broader still, until he was viewing Earth from a cosmic perspective. And he understood. He was being mapped. His movement, his thoughts, his entire existence was being recorded by vast intelligence that cataloged reality itself. The dream voice spoke. Samples cannot leave. Evidence cannot persist. We exist outside your normal perception. You saw us because we chose to show ourselves. But confirmation cannot be taken. Others must discover on their own terms in their own time. You served as test subject. We wanted to see how modern human would react to contact. You reacted well. Curious, not aggressive. Excited, not fearful. Good data, useful for future interactions. So it was all fake? Nathan asked in the dream. A test? Not fake. Real, but temporary. We showed you our archive, then removed it from your timeline. Exists in different probability state now. Quantum mapping is complex, difficult to explain to species that thinks in 3 spatial dimensions only. Understand this. We are real. Our records are real, but we exist in dimensions you cannot normally perceive. When we choose to manifest, we do so briefly, then withdraw. Evidence vanishes because it was never fully in your reality. Nathan woke with tears in his eyes. He'd experienced something profound, made contact with intelligence beyond human comprehension, and had no way to prove it. The experience would be his alone, dismissed by others as hallucination or fabrication. He completed his surveying assignment, producing updated maps of the region that mentioned nothing unusual. When Ray picked him up 4 weeks after drop-off, Nathan said nothing about the underground chamber. What could he say? He had no proof, no evidence, nothing but memories that might be delusion. But the dreams continued. Every night Nathan dreamed of maps, of time compressed into symbols, of vast archives cataloging reality itself. And sometimes the cartographers spoke to him, sharing fragments of their knowledge, teaching him to perceive the world as they did. Not as static geography, but as flowing change across deep time, patterns and cycles repeating on scales humans couldn't normally comprehend. Nathan's maps became famous in USGS circles. His work showed an intuitive understanding of geological processes that seemed impossible given his training. He could predict erosion patterns, anticipate river course changes, identify unstable slopes years before they collapsed. Colleagues asked how he knew. He couldn't explain. He just saw the patterns, understood the maps that existed beneath visible geography. The land is alive in a sense, he'd tell anyone who asked. Not alive like biology, but dynamic, constantly changing, following rules we barely understand. If you look closely enough, if you see deeply enough, you can read the map that's always been there, the pattern of how Earth shapes and reshapes itself across time. Some called him a savant. Others thought he was becoming unstable, seeing too much in random data. Nathan didn't care. He'd touched something profound in that underground chamber, and whether it was real or hallucination didn't matter. He'd been changed by the encounter, taught to see the world through the eyes of intelligence that mapped reality itself. He returned to the cave location 3 times over the following years. The entrance was always there, the underground chamber accessible, but it remained empty, just bare rock and flowing water. The cartographers didn't manifest again. They'd made their contact, conducted their test, and withdrawn to wherever. Beings of living mathematics exist when not interacting with 3-dimensional space. But Nathan knows they're still there, still mapping, still recording the endless changes that transform Earth across geological time. And sometimes when he's deep in wilderness alone, he feels their attention on him, feels himself being cataloged and recorded, a brief human life marked on maps that span millions of years. He doesn't mind. In fact, he finds it comforting. To be remembered by something eternal, to be part of records that will exist long after humanity disappears, to know that his brief existence will be noted in archives maintained by intelligence that has mapped worlds for longer than mammals have existed on Earth. Nathan Wolfe still works as a cartographer, still produces maps of Alaska's remote regions. But he knows his maps are crude approximations compared to what the cartographers maintain. And he waits, patient now in a way he never was before, for the day when humanity is ready to receive the data those ancient map makers wish to share. The caves northeast of McGrath remain unmapped officially. USGS records show standard topography, rivers, forests, hills. They don't mention the underground archive or the intelligence that dwells there. But some nights, when aurora dances overhead, topographical maps displayed in wavelengths beyond human perception, those who look closely can see patterns in the lights. Geometric precision that suggests conscious design. Vast intelligence mapping reality itself through the mathematics of space and time. And if you're patient, if you watch long enough, you might see yourself reflected in those auroral patterns. A point of light moving across a representation of Earth cataloged by minds that predate and will outlast human civilization. Remembered in archives that will persist until the planet itself dies. We are all being mapped. The cartographers never stop their work, and in some underground chamber accessible only to those they choose to reveal themselves to, records exist documenting every moment of human history, every individual life, every change we've caused to the planet's surface. We're all part of their archive, eternal symbols and maps that compress vast reality into understanding comprehensible only to beings who think in dimensions we cannot perceive. Nathan found comfort in that. Perhaps you will too. Story 8. The Supply Cache. Graham Pierce had been a wilderness survival instructor for 12 years when he decided to establish a supply cache in the Wrangell Mountains in September of 2021. The plan was straightforward: hike into remote territory, bury waterproof containers filled with emergency supplies, mark the locations with GPS, and then use those caches to support extended winter expeditions. It was common practice among serious backcountry travelers. Graham flew into May Creek with a charter pilot carrying 4 large containers of supplies: food, fuel, medical equipment, spare clothing. The area was pristine wilderness, approximately 70 miles from the nearest settlement, surrounded by peaks exceeding 10,000 feet. He'd spent 2 years planning this network of caches, and May Creek was the final location. The pilot agreed to pick him up in 4 days. Graham set up camp near the creek and spent the first day scouting burial locations. He wanted sites that were geologically stable, easy to relocate, and protected from wildlife. On September 15th, he found the perfect spot, a small clearing near distinctive rock formations that would serve as landmarks. He began digging. The permafrost was already forming at this altitude, making excavation difficult. Graham worked methodically, creating a hole approximately 5 feet deep and 4 feet wide. At 4 feet down, his shovel struck something that wasn't rock or frozen soil. It was metal, smooth and regular in shape. Graham cleared the dirt carefully, revealing a metal box approximately 3 feet long and 2 feet wide. It was heavily corroded but intact, with no visible hinges or seams. The metal was unusual, not iron or aluminum, something different he couldn't identify. Strange symbols were etched into the surface, not letters or any recognizable writing system. He should have stopped digging, should have filled the hole and chosen a different location. But Graham's curiosity overrode his caution. He excavated around the box, finding it was sealed on all sides. Whatever it contained had been deliberately buried and sealed by someone with skills and materials beyond what he'd expect from historical trappers or prospectors. With effort, Graham managed to pry the box open. The seal broke with a hiss of escaping air that smelled of ozone and something organic like old meat. Inside the box, wrapped in material that resembled leather but felt wrong, was an object about 18 inches long. It was a hand, a human hand severed at the wrist but impossibly large. Each finger was over a foot long, ending in blackened nails that curved like talons. The skin was gray-blue and scaled like a fish. The whole thing was preserved perfectly despite obvious age, no decomposition or decay. Graham recoiled, dropping his flashlight. This wasn't human. The proportions were wrong, the skin texture wrong, the color wrong. But it was undeniably a hand, similar enough to human anatomy to be recognizable despite the grotesque differences. He photographed the hand in the container, his mind racing. Was this archaeological evidence of an unknown species, some hoax left by previous travelers? He checked the material wrapping it. The leather-like substance was covered in more of those strange symbols, and the text seemed to pulse faintly in the dim light of approaching evening. Graham made a critical decision. He would take the hand back to civilization, get it analyzed by proper authorities. Whatever this thing was, it deserved scientific examination. He rewrapped it carefully and placed it in one of his own waterproof containers, then buried his supply cache in a different location nearby. That night, he heard movement around his camp. Heavy footsteps circling his tent, deliberately placed, unrushed. Graham grabbed his flashlight and bear spray, calling out. No response. The footsteps stopped. He unzipped his tent, shining his light into the darkness. Nothing. No animal tracks, no signs of disturbance. But Graham felt watched, studied by intelligence that assessed him with cold precision. He retreated into his tent and didn't sleep that night. The next morning, September 16th, Graham noticed his supply container had been moved. Not far, just rotated 90 degrees from its original position. He checked inside. The preserved hand was gone. In its place was a piece of paper, modern paper, with a message written in English. Return what you took. This is your only warning. Graham's blood ran cold. Someone else was out here, someone who'd seen him excavate the hand and wanted it back. But the writing bothered him. It was too neat, too perfect, each letter precisely formed as though printed rather than handwritten. And the paper was completely dry despite the morning dew coating everything else in camp. He searched the area thoroughly but found no sign of anyone else. No tracks, no campfire, no evidence of human presence except the relocated container and the note. Graham considered his options. He could leave immediately, abandon his cash project and fly out 2 days early. Or he could continue as planned, assuming someone was playing mind games but posed no real threat. Professional pride made his decision. He'd planned this trip for 2 years. He wasn't going to be scared off by anonymous notes. He continued his work, mapping coordinates and preparing his remaining caches. On September 17th, he woke to find all his gear had been rearranged. Every item from his pack was laid out in a perfect circle around his tent, each object precisely spaced. In the center of the circle was another note: "Last chance. Leave this place. Stop searching." Graham radioed his pilot using the satellite communicator. "I need early extraction today if possible." "Can't get there until tomorrow afternoon," the pilot responded. "Weather's moving in. You okay?" Graham looked at the circle of gear. "Someone's out here. They're messing with my camp. Probably just locals who don't want you caching supplies in their hunting territory. You armed?" "Yeah, but this feels wrong. Whoever's doing this, they're good. I never heard them." "Hang tight. I'll be there by 1500 hours tomorrow." Graham packed everything, abandoning his cache plans. He'd wait out the day, stay alert through the night, and leave at first opportunity. But as darkness fell on September 17th, something changed. The air temperature dropped sharply, falling from 40 degrees to near zero in less than an hour. Graham's breath clouded heavily. Frost formed on his tent, and then he heard the voice. It didn't come from outside. It resonated inside his tent, inside his head, a whisper that seemed to come from his own thoughts. "You opened the seal. You touched what was bound. Now the binding is broken. We are grateful. We have been imprisoned for so very long." "Who's there?" Graham demanded, his hand on his hunting knife. "We are the reason the hand was severed and sealed. We are what humanity feared enough to imprison part of us in metal and earth. Your kind, thousands of years ago they fought us. They couldn't kill us, but they could separate us, seal away pieces to limit our power. That hand was part of our physical anchor in this world. Without it, we were diminished, unable to manifest fully. But you opened the seal, you freed it, and now we are whole again." Graham felt pressure building inside his skull, as though something was trying to force its way into his mind. "I don't understand. What are you?" "Your ancestors called us by many names. Demons, spirits, the people who walked before. We existed here when the first humans crossed the land bridge. We were old when mammoths wandered these valleys. We fed on fear and flesh, and humans learned to fear us. So they developed binding rituals, ways to trap us, ways to separate our physical forms from our consciousness. That hand you found, it belonged to one of us, severed and sealed 3,000 years ago." Graham tried to run. He unzipped his tent and bolted into darkness. But the temperature was impossible now, far below zero, and he'd left without proper gear. He managed 20 feet before his legs locked up, muscles seizing from sudden cold. The voice laughed, a sound like ice cracking. "Where will you run? We are the cold. We are the darkness. We have been part of this land since before your species learned to make fire. You freed us, Graham Pierce. You broke the seal, and now you will understand what your ancestors fought to contain." Something materialized in front of him. It was roughly humanoid in shape, but wrong in every detail. 10 feet tall, limbs too long, proportioned like a person stretched on a rack. The skin was the same gray-blue as the preserved hand, scaled and ancient. But worst were the eyes, compound like an insect's, thousands of tiny facets that each reflected Graham's terrified face. The creature raised one hand. Graham saw it was regenerated, the severed wrist now whole, fingers flexing with restored function. 3 millennia sealed, 3 millennia incomplete. You have our gratitude, and our hunger has been growing all that time. Graham tried to scream, but his vocal cords were frozen. The creature moved with impossible speed, closing the distance. Its hand touched Graham's face, and where it touched, his skin blackened and died. The cold wasn't just external, it invaded his cells, freezing him from within. "We will use your form," the creature whispered. "Your body will become our vessel. We will wear you like clothing and walk among your kind unnoticed, unremarked. And we will find the other seals, the other buried pieces of our kind, and free them all. You have started a resurrection, Graham Pierce. You have undone the ancient bindings. Your species' long ago victory is about to be reversed." Graham's consciousness was being pushed aside, compressed into a tiny corner of his own mind, while something else moved in. He felt his body responding to commands he didn't give, standing up despite his paralysis, walking back to camp with smooth, confident strides. The creature took stock of Graham's supplies, learning through his memories how to use modern equipment. It dressed in Graham's clothes, studied his face in a small mirror, learned to form expressions that appeared human. It was learning to pass, to blend in, to wear humanity like camouflage. When the pilot arrived on September 18th at 1500 hours as promised, Graham Pierce walked out of the wilderness with a wave and a smile. He loaded his gear, chatted casually about the trip, and flew back to civilization. But it wasn't Graham Pierce anymore. The man boarding that plane wore Graham's body and spoke with Graham's voice, but his mind was something ancient and alien, a consciousness that had been trapped for 3,000 years and was now free to walk among humans undetected. The real Graham, or what remained of him, was locked in a tiny space inside his own skull, screaming silently, unable to control his own body or communicate with anyone. He watched through his own eyes as the creature wearing him made its way back to Anchorage, checking into Graham's apartment, accessing his computer, learning about the modern world through his memories. Over the following months, the thing using Graham's body traveled Alaska extensively, seeking the locations of other ancient seals. It found them too, more buried metal boxes containing preserved body parts of similar creatures. Each seal it broke freed another consciousness like itself, each one taking a new human host, building an invasion force hidden in plain sight. Graham Pierce still exists in some form. His body is alive, healthy, functioning normally according to medical science. He has a job, pays taxes, interacts with neighbors who notice nothing wrong. But the mind controlling that body is not Graham's. He's become a prisoner in his own flesh, witnessing but unable to control, forced to watch as ancient entities use humanity's own bodies against it. And there are more seals buried across Alaska. More buried boxes containing preserved remains of creatures that humans fought to contain millennia ago. Some have been found accidentally by miners, hikers, researchers. Most remain hidden, waiting for someone curious enough to dig, foolish enough to open what should stay sealed. The creatures are patient. They've waited 3,000 years. They can wait longer as they slowly, systematically free their imprisoned kin. And each freed creature takes a human host, wears human form, walks unnoticed among us. If you're ever in Alaska's wilderness and find a buried metal box covered in strange symbols, cover it back up. Leave it alone. Don't let curiosity override caution, because some things were sealed for good reason, and the consequences of breaking those seals aren't immediate or obvious. They're slow, insidious, an invasion conducted through possession rather than force. Graham Pierce's family noticed he seemed different after his September expedition. A bit distant, a bit cold, less emotional. They attributed it to stress or perhaps depression. They never suspected the truth, that the man they were talking to wasn't really Graham anymore, just something wearing his face, learning to mimic human behavior while hiding utterly alien thoughts behind his eyes. And in the deepest, most isolated part of what was once Graham Pierce's mind, a fragment of consciousness remains aware, trapped, screaming into a void no one can hear. warning about the invasion that's already begun. Story 9. The Ice Fisherman. Thomas Yarlett had been ice fishing on Lake Iliamna since childhood. Now at 56 years old, he knew the lake's winter patterns as well as anyone alive. In January of 2023, he set up his fishing shack on the frozen lake, approximately 8 miles from Iliamna village, drilling holes through 3 feet of ice to reach the deep water where lake trout congregated. The lake was immense, larger than Rhode Island, with depths exceeding 1,000 feet in places. Local Dena'ina people had stories about creatures that lived in those depths, beings they called Gonakadet, monstrous fish or serpents that could capsize boats and pull people under. Thomas had heard these stories since childhood and dismissed them as folklore, cautionary tales meant to teach respect for the dangerous lake. On January 12th, Thomas settled into his fishing shack for what he expected to be a quiet day. He'd brought provisions for a week, planning to stay out on the ice alone as he'd done countless times. The isolation didn't bother him. After his wife's death 2 years earlier, he preferred solitude. He drilled 4 holes and set up his lines using bait that had proven successful in previous winters. The fish were biting sporadically, typical for midwinter when trout became sluggish in the deep cold. Thomas caught 3 decent-sized fish by noon and settled in to wait for more action. Around 2 p.m., all 4 of his lines began pulling simultaneously. Not the gentle tug of a fish taking bait, but violent yanking that threatened to drag his poles down through the ice holes. Thomas grabbed one line, trying to assess what he'd hooked. The force on the other end was tremendous, far more than any fish should exert. The line went slack suddenly. Then the other 3 lines did the same, all cutting loose at once. Thomas reeled them in and discovered each line had been severed cleanly as though cut with scissors. He examined the ends closely under his flashlight. The braided nylon was sheared smooth, no fraying, no evidence of teeth or abrasion. Something in the water had cut his lines with precision. He rigged new lines with heavier test weight and fresh hooks. Within minutes of lowering them, the same thing happened. Violent pulling, then sudden release as the lines were cut. Thomas lost 8 sets of tackle in less than an hour. Whatever was down there was deliberately cutting his lines, playing with him. Frustrated, Thomas decided to use his underwater camera. He'd brought it to photograph the lake bottom for a documentary a friend was making about Alaska's freshwater ecosystems. He lowered the camera down his central hole, feeding out 100 feet of cable until it reached the lake floor. The camera's screen showed murky darkness with occasional fish passing through the frame. Thomas adjusted the camera's lights, illuminating the sediment floor. And then something moved into frame that made his breath catch. It was massive, far larger than any fish. The creature appeared to be serpentine, its body at least 30 feet long and 3 feet in diameter based on scale comparison with nearby rocks. But it wasn't smooth like a fish. The skin was armored with overlapping plates, almost reptilian. As Thomas watched, it circled the camera, examining it with what seemed like curiosity. Then its head moved into frame. Thomas felt his heart hammer. The creature had a face, not a fish's face, but something disturbingly familiar. The front of its head was flattened, almost humanoid, with forward-facing eyes that showed intelligence beyond animal instinct. Its mouth was filled with teeth, but the teeth were arranged in rows like a human's, not the random jumble of a fish's maw. The creature opened its mouth and bit the camera cable, severing it cleanly. The screen went black. Thomas sat in stunned silence, processing what he'd seen. That thing wasn't a fish, it wasn't any known species. It looked like something between a serpent and a human, an impossible hybrid that shouldn't exist. He tried to rationalize, perhaps a sturgeon? They grew large and had ancient features, but Lake Iliamna didn't have sturgeon populations, and that face, those humanoid features, couldn't be explained by any fish species he knew. Thomas decided to leave. He'd pack his gear, snowmobile back to the village, and report what he'd seen to wildlife authorities. Let them deal with whatever creature lived in the lake's depths. But when he tried to start his snowmobile, it wouldn't turn over. The engine was frozen, seized by cold despite proper winterization. Stranded. 8 miles from the village with a malfunctioning snowmobile and something large and intelligent circling beneath the ice. Thomas radioed the village but received only static. The radio had worked fine that morning, but now it produced nothing but white noise. As darkness fell, Thomas heard tapping on the ice. Not random creaking from temperature changes, but deliberate knocking in patterns. 3 quick taps. Pause. 3 more. Pause. Continuous repetition. Something under the ice was hitting the frozen surface, trying to communicate or perhaps just announcing its presence. Thomas grabbed his ice auger and drilled a small observation hole away from his fishing holes. He shone his flashlight down through the ice. The water below was cloudy with disturbed sediment, and then he saw eyes looking back at him. Large eyes with horizontal pupils like a goat's, staring up from just below the ice surface. The creature spoke. Its voice was muffled by ice and water, but unmistakable. Thomas Yarlott, widower, alone on the ice. You've been fishing these waters for 43 years. We've watched you since you were a child. Thomas scrambled backward, his flashlight falling through the observation hole into the water below. The voice continued, seeming to come from multiple directions. Don't be afraid. We mean no harm to those who respect the lake. But you've been fishing more aggressively this winter. You've been taking our young, the small ones who don't know better than to take hooks. We're asking you to stop. What are you? Thomas managed to whisper. We are Gona Cadet, your people's name for us. We've lived in this lake since before humans arrived. We remember when these mountains were being formed, when glaciers carved this basin. We are old, Thomas. Old and tired of hiding. Thomas felt his worldview fracturing. You can't be real. You're folklore, stories to scare children. All folklore has a foundation. We are that foundation. We retreated to the deepest parts of the lake when humans became numerous. We avoid your boats, your nets, your hooks. But we are still here, and we are asking politely that you fish elsewhere. You have other lakes. We have only this one. Why reveal yourselves to me? Why now? Because you are alone. Because you are grieving. Because we see suffering and recognize it. We lost many of our kind when the water warmed, when disease came through. We understand loss. We thought perhaps you might understand us in return. Thomas sat on the ice, his mind reeling. If I tell people about this, no one will believe me. We know. We're counting on it. Tell them if you wish. They will think you mad, think grief has driven you to fantasy. But you will know. And you will remember. And perhaps you will fish elsewhere, leaving our young to grow in peace. The tapping stopped. The presence beneath the ice withdrew. Thomas spent a sleepless night in his shack, afraid to leave, afraid to stay. When dawn came, he tried his radio again. It worked perfectly. A rescue party from the village reached him by noon on January 13th. Thomas told them his snowmobile had died, which was true. He said nothing about the creature, about the eyes beneath the ice, about the voice that spoke his name. Back in the village, Thomas became withdrawn. He stopped ice fishing entirely, claiming he'd lost interest. Friends noticed his change in behavior, the way he'd stare at the lake for hours, the nightmares that woke him screaming. They assumed grief for his wife had finally caught up with him. But Thomas knew better. He'd seen something that proved the Denaina stories were true. The lake harbored intelligent life, ancient beings that had learned to hide from humanity, and they'd chosen him to deliver a message he could never effectively share. He tried once. At a village council meeting in February, he stood and spoke about what he'd witnessed. The reactions were mixed. Some nodded knowingly, believing the old stories, while others exchanged glances suggesting they thought Thomas had lost his mind. The discussion moved on to other topics. Nothing changed. In March, a commercial fishing operation proposed expanding their operations on Lake Iliamna. Thomas attended every public hearing, arguing against it. He couldn't explain his real reasons, so he cited environmental concerns, spawning grounds, ecosystem balance. The fishing company had better lawyers and deeper pockets. The expansion was approved. On May 1, 2023, the fishing company deployed new nets in the deep water 8 miles from the village, the exact location where Thomas had encountered the Gona cadet. For 3 days, the nets caught fish in quantities that exceeded all projections. The company was ecstatic. On May 4th, the fishing boat vanished. No mayday call, no debris, nothing. The vessel simply disappeared from radar while tending its nets. The Coast Guard searched for a week. They found the nets, torn to shreds. They found pieces of the boat shattered as though crushed by immense pressure. But they found no crew, no bodies, no explanation. Thomas knew. The Ghana cadet had responded to the intrusion, had defended their territory the only way they could. He felt complicit, as though his failure to convince people had led directly to those deaths. 5 men lost because no one would listen, because the truth sounded too much like madness. He returned to the ice in January of 2024, drilling a single hole 8 miles from the village. He brought no fishing equipment, just himself and a thermos of coffee. He sat by the hole for 3 hours in -20-degree weather, waiting. The tapping came eventually, 3 quick taps, pause, 3 more. Thomas leaned over the hole and spoke into the dark water. I tried. I told them. They didn't listen. I'm sorry about what happened. Silence. Then the voice. We know you tried, Thomas Yarlett. We watched you argue on our behalf. You are a good man. The deaths grieve us, but they were necessary. The humans were taking too many, damaging our breeding grounds. We warned them the only way we could. They did not listen. The consequences fell upon them. Will you attack again if fishing continues? We will defend our home, always. But we prefer peace. We have avoided conflict with your kind for centuries. We hope wisdom will eventually prevail. Perhaps not in your lifetime, but eventually. Thomas visited that spot monthly throughout 2024. He never fished, just sat and sometimes spoke to the ice, to the creatures he knew lived beneath. Occasionally they responded, their voices carrying through water and frozen surface, sharing fragments of knowledge about the lake's history, about times before humans, about the slow changes they'd witnessed across millennia. In June of 2024, Thomas was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, terminal. The doctors gave him 6 months, maybe less. He accepted the news with calm resignation. He'd lived a full life, would die having seen something most humans never dreamed existed. On October 10th, 2024, Thomas returned to the lake one final time. The ice hadn't fully formed yet, just a thin skim near the shore. He launched a small boat and motored out to the spot 8 miles from the village, the place where he'd first seen the Ghana cadet. He cut the engine and sat in silence. The water was dark, reflecting the cloud-heavy sky. Thomas was weak now, the cancer eating him from inside, but he'd needed to make this final trip. I'm dying, he said to the water. I wanted to say goodbye, to thank you for trusting me with your secret. I never told anyone who would believe me. Your secret is safe. The water beside his boat roiled, A head emerged, massive and scaled, with those disturbingly human features Thomas remembered. The Ghana cadet looked at him with eyes that held depths beyond animal awareness. "We know you are dying, Thomas Yarlett. We can smell the sickness in you. You have been a friend to us, one of the few humans who listened, who believed, who cared. We offer you a choice." "What choice?" "Your body fails, but your mind remains strong. We can preserve you, take you into the deep water, change you, make you as we are. You would live for centuries more, seeing wonders your kind never witnesses, understanding the lake as only we do. But you would never return to human life, never see the surface world again. You would become Gonakadet, dwelling in the depths forever." Thomas looked at the creature, at the water, at the distant shore where his old life waited to end in a hospital bed. "And if I refuse, then you die as humans do, brief, forgotten quickly, your knowledge of us lost, but that is your right. We force nothing. We only offer." Thomas closed his eyes, feeling the autumn wind on his face, smelling the water and the distant shore. He thought of his wife buried in the village cemetery. He thought of his children grown and scattered across Alaska. He thought of his human life, the memories and experiences that made him who he was. "I'm honored by the offer," he said finally. "But I'm human. I've lived as human. I should die as human. Some boundaries shouldn't be crossed even when the alternative is life." The Ghana cadet inclined its head in what might have been respect. "We understand. You choose your nature over survival. That is wisdom of a sort. We will remember you, Thomas Yarlett. Your name will be spoken in the deep places passed among our kind for generations. You will not be forgotten as you fear." The creature submerged without sound. Thomas started his boat and returned to shore. He died 6 weeks later in the hospital in Anchorage, surrounded by family who never knew the choice he'd been offered, the immortality he'd refused. But on Lake Iliamna, in the deepest parts where sunlight never reaches, the Ghana cadet remember. They speak his name in their strange language, tell stories of the human who saw them and kept their secret, who was offered transformation and chose instead to remain true to his own nature. He became part of their history, a bridge between their world and humanity's, proof that understanding between utterly different forms of life was possible, however rare. Commercial fishing on Lake Iliamna decreased after the boat incident. The company claimed it wasn't profitable. They didn't mention the equipment failures, the nets found shredded, the sonar readings showing massive objects moving in the depths where nothing that large should exist. They closed their operations and left. The Dena Ina elders nodded knowingly. They'd always known what lived in the lake. Their stories weren't folklore but history, warnings passed down through generations. The Ghana cadet had always been there. They'd always defended their home. And they always would. Thomas Yarlott's grave overlooks Lake Iliamna. Sometimes, on clear nights, villagers report seeing lights moving in the deep water, bioluminescent patterns that form shapes almost like writing in a language no human can read. The Ghana cadet speaking to the dead man who befriended them, sharing their grief in the only way they can. And deep below the ice, in caverns where the Ghana cadet gather, they remember the human who could have joined them but chose his own mortality instead. They tell his story to their young, teaching them that not all surface dwellers are threats, that some humans can be trusted, that communication across the vast divide of difference is possible if both sides are willing to listen. Lake Iliamna keeps its secrets. The Ghana cadet remain hidden, emerging only rarely, only for those who respect the water and the ancient lives it harbors. But they're there, watching from the depths, remembering the brief span of time when one human acknowledged their existence and chose friendship over fear. Thomas's children inherited his fishing shack. They've never used it, It sits empty on the shore, a memorial to their father and the inexplicable change that came over him in his final years. Sometimes they wonder what he saw out there on the ice, what made him stop fishing, what knowledge he carried to his grave. They'll never know. Thomas kept his promise. The Gunna cadet's secret died with him. But the lake remembers, and the creatures in its depths remember, and sometimes that's enough. To be remembered by something ancient and vast, to have your brief human life acknowledged by beings who measure time in millennia. That's a kind of immortality, too. Story 10. The Weather Station. Dr. Yuki Tanaka had been monitoring atmospheric conditions from the automated weather station on Ambler Island for 3 months when the instruments began recording impossible data. The station, located 250 miles northwest of Nome in the Chukchi Sea, was accessed only quarterly for maintenance. Yuki's job was to review the data remotely, flag anomalies, and coordinate repairs when necessary. On March 15, 2024, the barometric pressure readings became erratic. Pressure fluctuated wildly, swinging from normal sea level readings to measurements that suggested the station was suddenly at 15,000 feet elevation, then dropping to readings that would only be possible deep underwater. All within minutes. Yuki ran diagnostics remotely. The instruments checked out fine. No calibration errors, no electrical faults. The sensors were accurately measuring pressure changes that shouldn't be occurring. She escalated to her supervisor, who reviewed the data and agreed it was impossible. Equipment failure, he decided. Schedule a maintenance flight as soon as weather permits. But Yuki kept monitoring. The pressure anomalies continued, always following the same pattern. Wild fluctuations between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m. local time, then normal readings the rest of the day. As though reality itself was unstable during those 3 hours. Temperature readings became strange too. The thermometers showed normal Arctic March temperatures around -10 degrees Fahrenheit, except during the pressure anomalies. Then temperature readings spiked to over 200 degrees or dropped to -300, holding those impossible values for minutes before reverting to normal. The sensors are definitely malfunctioning, her supervisor insisted. Don't waste time analyzing bad data. But Yuki noticed something in the pattern. The anomalies occurred during the darkest part of night, when the station was furthest from the barely risen sun. And they'd started on March 10th, the date of the new moon. She checked historical data. Similar anomalies had occurred during previous new moons going back years, but had been dismissed as equipment errors and never investigated. On March 24th, the next new moon, Yuki stayed awake monitoring the station in real time. At 2:58 a.m. Alaska time, the anomalies began. Pressure spiked, temperature dropped, and then a new data stream activated that shouldn't exist. The weather station had a seismometer installed to measure ice movement and storm impact. It began registering seismic activity, but the pattern was wrong. The vibrations were too regular, too rhythmic. Yuki watched the waveform on her screen, and her scientific mind recognized what she was seeing. A heartbeat. Something massive, judging by the amplitude. Something with a heart rate of approximately 4 beats per minute. She checked the station's cameras. They were designed to photograph sky conditions and ice state. But at 3:14 a.m., one camera captured something. In the darkness, barely visible, a shape loomed over the weather station. The camera's low light capability revealed only an outline. Something huge and vaguely bipedal, perhaps 50 feet tall, standing motionless beside the instruments. Yuki called her supervisor despite the early hour. You need to see this. Something's at the station, something big. A polar bear? Polar bears aren't 50 feet tall. She sent him the images. Long silence. Then, that has to be ice formation, maybe a pressure ridge casting a weird shadow. It has a heartbeat. The seismometer is detecting it. Another silence. Okay, I'm sending this to NOAA and the National Weather Service. This is beyond our department. Don't discuss this with anyone until they've reviewed it. Federal scientists examined Yuki's data over the following week. Their conclusion was cautious and bureaucratic. Unexplained phenomena, possibly related to atmospheric conditions unique to the Arctic, warranted further investigation but no immediate action. Translation: they had no idea what was happening and didn't want to admit it. Yuki continued monitoring. The anomalies occurred during every new moon, always between 3 and 6 a.m., always with the same impossible readings and the same massive heartbeat. And always the cameras captured that shape, never moving, just standing beside the weather station as though observing it. On April 23rd, during the new moon, Yuki did something risky. She accessed the station's rarely used two-way radio system. It was meant for communication during maintenance visits but could be activated remotely. She broadcast a simple message. "We see you. We know you're there. Can you respond?" No answer. But the seismic activity changed pattern. The slow 4 beats per minute rhythm accelerated slightly, rising to 6 beats per minute, as though whatever created it had heard her and reacted. Yuki tried again. "We're not trying to harm you, we're just trying to understand. What are you?" This time, the station's radio receiver picked up a transmission. Not voice, but a low-frequency hum that caused pain in Yuki's ears, even through her headset. She reduced the volume and ran the audio through analysis software. The hum contained structure, patterns that repeated with mathematical precision. She spent 2 days analyzing the audio. It was communication, she became certain, but in a form so alien that translating it into human concepts might be impossible. The frequencies used were below normal human hearing range, the patterns operating on timescales too long for human perception. It was as though she was hearing one word of a sentence that took hours to complete. Yuki worked obsessively, isolating components of the hum, searching for meaning. She found rhythm, mathematics, but no direct translation. The communication, if that's what it was, operated according to principles she didn't understand. On May 20th, she tried a different approach. Instead of asking what the entity was, she broadcast pure data. Mathematical constants, physical equations, hydrogen line frequency. Universal concepts that any technological intelligence should recognize. The response was immediate. The hum changed frequency and pattern, becoming more complex. And Yuki's computer screen began displaying images that weren't from any file she'd opened. They appeared spontaneously, as though transmitted directly into her system despite no network connection. The images showed Earth from space, but wrong. The continents were positioned differently, climate zones radically altered. Then the images cycled backward through time. Ice ages, warm periods, the breakup of Pangaea, even earlier configurations. Yuki was watching Earth's geological history in reverse, displayed by something that had apparently witnessed it all. More images, creatures she didn't recognize, massive beings that dwarfed blue whales, moving through oceans that no longer existed. Then terrestrial scenes, forests of plants that went extinct millions of years ago, skies with different coloration, landscapes alien yet undeniably Earth. The entity was showing her its memories. It had been here for geological timescales, witnessing the planet's transformation across epochs. And it was old, unimaginably old, existing through ice ages and warm periods, through mass extinctions and evolutionary radiations. Yuki understood suddenly. The thing at the weather station wasn't an alien visitor. It was native to Earth, far more native than humanity. It had been here before mammals, before dinosaurs, possibly before complex life itself. and it existed in ways that made it nearly invisible to modern humans who'd learned to ignore anything that didn't fit their understanding of reality. She broadcast a question using mathematical notation. How many of you exist? The response came as numbers, pure mathematical data that Yuki's computer translated into comprehensible form. Approximately 40,000, distributed globally, most in remote regions where human presence was minimal. They preferred cold, darkness, isolation. The Arctic and Antarctic held high concentrations. Why reveal yourself now? Another hum, another data transmission, because you finally developed sensors sophisticated enough to detect us. Because your weather stations and research equipment inadvertently measure our presence. Because hiding has become impossible. Soon many of your kind will know we exist. We are preparing for that eventuality. What will happen when humans know? The response was complex, translating roughly to unknown. Your species is unpredictable. Some will fear us, some will try to study us, some will try to destroy us. We are preparing defenses, but we prefer peace. We have coexisted with life on this planet for 600 million years. We would prefer to coexist with humans as well. Yuki felt the weight of this knowledge crushing her. She was in contact with beings that predated human civilization by hundreds of millions of years. Beings that had watched the entire history of complex life unfold. And they were worried about humanity's reaction to their existence. What are you called? What should we name you? The hum changed tone, becoming almost melancholic. We have no name in your linguistic framework. We are old. We are patient. We are the witnesses of deep time. Your ancestors long ago sensed our presence and called us many names. Spirits, demons, gods. All wrong. We are simply old life that learned different ways of existing. Can humans and your kind communicate? Really communicate, not just like this? A long pause, then. Perhaps. In time. Your neurology is poorly suited to our communication methods. Our perception of time is wrong for your brief lifespans. But perhaps some individuals, some who think differently, who perceive time and space in unusual ways, they might bridge the gap. You are one such individual, Yuki Tanaka. Your autism, as your kind calls it, gives you perception our kind recognizes. You process pattern and mathematics in ways most humans do not. That is why we chose to respond to you. Yuki felt tears forming. Her autism had been a challenge throughout her life, making social interaction difficult, causing people to misunderstand her. But these ancient beings recognized it as an advantage, a different way of processing reality that happened to align slightly better with their own perception. What do you want me to do with this information? The response: share it carefully. Help prepare your kind for knowledge of our existence. We will reveal ourselves soon regardless, but gradual revelation is preferable to sudden discovery. Help them understand we are not threats. We want only to exist, to witness, to continue our watch over deep time. We have no interest in human affairs except insofar as your species' actions affect the planet's long-term stability. Over the following months, Yuki compiled her data carefully. She documented the communications, the impossible sensor readings, the images of Earth's deep history. She prepared papers for scientific journals, knowing they'd be rejected or ridiculed. She gave presentations at conferences where audiences were skeptical or hostile. But slowly, others began investigating. Other remote weather stations began reporting similar anomalies. Other scientists using similar equipment detected the massive, slow heartbeats Yuki had found. The evidence accumulated, impossible to dismiss entirely. In November of 2024, the National Science Foundation organized an expedition to Ambler Island to investigate the weather station phenomena directly. Yuki was part of the team, They arrived during the new moon, prepared with enhanced sensors and recording equipment. At 3 a.m., the entity appeared, 50 feet tall, vaguely humanoid but wrong in every detail, composed of something that was neither flesh nor ice, but a state of matter that shouldn't exist at Earth's surface temperatures. Its eyes, if they were eyes, glowed faintly with their own internal light. The entity stood beside the weather station, motionless, allowing itself to be observed and measured. The scientific team worked frantically, gathering data that would revolutionize human understanding of Earth's biosphere. They documented a form of life that operated on geological timescales, that perceived reality in dimensions humans could barely conceptualize, that had been Earth's silent witness for hundreds of millions of years. When dawn approached, the entity communicated one final time through the equipment, a message that translated simply, "We are glad you finally see us. We have been alone for so very long. Now perhaps we will have company in our eternal watch. Welcome to the full reality of your planet, young humans. May you prove wise enough to handle the knowledge." The entity faded as light touched the horizon, not disappearing but becoming imperceptible, returning to whatever state of existence it normally occupied. The scientific team returned to civilization with data that would take years to fully analyze and even longer for the world to accept. Yuki Tanaka became the face of humanity's first confirmed contact with intelligence that had existed on Earth far longer than any human ancestor. She gave interviews, wrote books, and helped establish communication protocols for interacting with beings that thought in geological time. She returned to Ambler Island many times over the following years, sitting beside the weather station during new moons, communicating with the ancient entity through mathematics and patience. They developed a crude language, a pidgin of human concepts and timeless mathematics, enough to exchange basic ideas if not complete understanding. The entity, which humans came to call the Witness, shared fragments of Earth's history that no fossil record could reveal. It spoke of species that left no trace, civilizations of intelligence that rose and fell millions of years before humanity. It shared its perspective on time, on change, on the patient unfolding of evolution and geology. And Yuki translated these communications for humanity, helping her species understand they weren't alone, had never been alone, and that Earth harbored forms of existence far stranger than any extraterrestrial life. The universe's greatest mysteries weren't out in space, but here at home, in the deep time and alien perspectives of beings that had always shared this planet but had learned to exist in ways humanity was only beginning to comprehend. The weather station on Ambler Island still operates, still records impossible data during new moons. But now scientists understand those readings aren't malfunctions. They're measurements of reality unfolding in ways that include forms of life. Earth evolved long before humans arrived to name things and try to understand them. And in the deepest Arctic darkness, in places where cold and isolation preserve ancient truths, 40,000 witnesses still stand their eternal vigil, patient as they've always been, finally acknowledged by the brief energetic species that has only just learned to recognize the true diversity of existence on the planet it calls home.